So I'm going to pose the question, are we really doing XAML the right way? On the assumption that I've been doing XAML since like 2007, which is 15, 16 years. And in that time, people who handwrite XAML always do it the same sort of way. All the XAML in the world looks the same, but it's been 15 years. Come on, can't we do things better? And the corollary of that is, hang on, have we been doing it wrong all this time if there's better ways of doing things? So I'm going to talk a bit about C#, I'm going to talk a bit about XAML. I'm going to assume that everyone here is familiar with .NET, knows a bit of C#, such that when I show you some C#, it's not confusing, and you're all familiar with XAML. Now I can't see you anymore because of the way I'm sharing, but I'm going to assume you're all nodding. If no one knows what XAML is, speak up now. Good, so you all know XAML, declaring UI markup used in UWP, WinUI, WPF, MAUI, Xamarin Forms, Avalonia, probably more. Brilliant. Okay, so XAML is not exactly loved. I think you would struggle on the interwebs to find people who say XAML's amazing, it's brilliant, everyone should be using it. Last year, Stack Overflow did their annual developer survey. Lots of interesting things came out of it, but one of the things I noticed in some of the analysis was that people were able to categorize all programming languages, and I'm going to treat XAML as a programming language. They could categorize all programming languages into dreaded or loved. I think dreaded is probably a bit harsh, but XAML definitely not loved, so maybe it does fall under the dreaded category. And the difference between the two, the loved programming languages are new, and or they have great tooling and regular updates. And obviously, neither of those things apply to XAML. Now, some people will argue that we get new versions of XAML every few years with every different version of XAML that comes out. So, MAUI introduced a new version of XAML. The WinUI version of XAML is different to the WPF one. And they're not the same, they're different. But the way the XAML works, pretty much exactly always been the same. The only major sort of change would be the introduction of compiled bindings. So the compiler able to verify the XAML at compile time rather than runtime, and some of the advanced binding features like Xbind. They make some things sort of new. So maybe we've had 2, maybe we've had 3 versions, but that's still not a lot for 15 years. And then tooling is questionable at best, shall we say. This is a quote. I could have picked a quote from pretty much any day in the last few years, looking at mailing lists and GitHub issues and things, people complaining about XAML tooling. I like this one because it's so extreme. It was more than 3 days ago they said it. But yeah, people really bemoan the lack of XAML tooling. But the world isn't just XAML. If you're building line of business apps, which is typically where a lot of desktop XAML apps are built, there are other alternatives. There's the web, and if you're just putting forms over data and you're in a line of business scenario, there's lots of low-code solutions. Both HTML and low-code can be faster and easier than building with XAML, so that kind of presents a challenge for those of us who have to use XAML to maintain existing apps, or those who want to keep using it in the future. So what do? We could just give up, but I see this as a fun technical problem, so let's see if we can solve it. Now, one of the ways people try and solve it is by saying, XAML's not great, I love C#, let's just do everything in C#. And that's an approach. So this is from the C#, the .NET MAUI markup extensions for C#. This is from their official sample app. And all this massive code, I haven't counted how many lines, there's about 15, 16 lines there, is putting 2 pieces of text on the screen. It's defining a template for items in a list, and each item is just 2 pieces of text. And to me, that feels a lot of code for 2 pieces of text. And in fact, the XAML is less, it's easier and simpler to read, I think, because I've been looking at XAML for a long time, but I've also been looking at C# for a long time. And we can say, oh, look, C# is easy to read. People who will claim that the C# is the way forward, we'll say, but C# doesn't have lots of great tooling yet, but we can make tooling for it. And my approach would be, well, if we've already got XAML, why don't we just improve the XAML tooling? So that's kind of my starting point. I'm not saying we should never use C#. I think that C# and XAML go together brilliantly. If you're doing, that's my alarm to actually wake me up on a normal day. If you heard that ringing in the background. If you're doing complicated UI things, you will invariably find that you need to use both C# and XAML to do some of those things, because C# is good for some things, XAML is good for other things. Let's use the best of what we have for each of the appropriate tasks. So what can we do about all this? And by way of implication, have we been doing it wrong all the whole time? So a couple of years ago, I got to work on a few projects where I had completely free reign on how I did everything. Obviously, this is a privileged position to be in some cases, being paid just to try stuff out. But one of the things I did at that time is say, well, rather than just write all the XAML like we've been doing it all along, what if I started to do things a bit differently based on what I've learned from using other languages over the past number of years? I asked myself, what if we treat XAML like a proper programming language? And by that, I mean, try and make it easier to work with, easy to read, write, all these things on screen, easy to understand, easy to spot mistakes, easy to maintain, not unnecessarily verbose, consistent. Obviously, a proper language has good tooling. I can't build lots of tooling just yet, but maybe that's something that will come in the future. And if the idea of treating it as a programming language is a bit of a jump for you, well, what if we just treat it like any other text-based file that is compiled into our application? Forget which languages we're using. If this is just text in a file, which we're going to feed into a compiler, how do we make that text in a file easier to work with? Now, I'm going to make lots of claims. I'm going to show you some stuff, but I want to be wrong about this. There's a few reasons for that. So I don't want to have been doing it wrong, in inverted commas, for the last 15 years. I don't want to have been doing it in a more complicated, slower, less productive, less easy to maintain fashion than I could have been doing. I don't think anyone would want that. I don't want to be the only person going, hang on a minute, can't we be doing this differently? Couldn't we be making this better? I don't want the responsibility, partly, but I also hope that all these code bases in existence aren't just being tolerated. Not people aren't working to improve things for everyone who's working with them. So I've had these ideas. I've worked on a couple of projects. I have been using these things, and they do seem to be making my life better. They have been making working with them funner, more enjoyable, easier to work with, and generally a positive thing. So this is a lot of my opinions. In the UK, we have the expression "a penny for your thoughts." This is a penny. Consider it a virtual offering for your thoughts, because although we're separated by a world or half a world, I'd love your feedback. I know that's hard in this hybrid interactive Teams environment, but we'll see how we go. And I've given variations of this talk, shared variations of these ideas in a number of places, and I've had feedback before. One of the things the person said was, I've never seen XAML done well before. This was kind of a flattering thing, but also kind of surprising and also kind of disappointing. It was kind of disappointing and surprising because this is someone who had been working with XAML for a couple of years. They were a senior developer, but they didn't know what good looked like. They didn't know what done well looked like, because everyone just does XAML the same way they've always done it, which is kind of a basic, unstructured, unthought out way. I'm not saying this is perfect, but stop for a minute and think about, what does good XAML look like? What does good any programming language look like? And if you know what it looks like and good for other languages, why haven't we stopped to ask what it's like in XAML? Someone also said, I already do this for other languages, and they listed a bunch, but not for XAML. And I think that's true of a lot of people. I'm not going to show you things which are massively new insights. What I'm doing is I'm going to take some best practices from elsewhere and apply them to XAML and show you how it makes XAML better. It surprises, concerns, shocks me that other people aren't doing this. Maybe you are for XAML, but for the vast majority of cases, people aren't. And someone who had no experience with XAML, they were just there because their company was sponsoring the event. They said, why is XAML development like this? So let's stop for a moment and think about history while I take a sip of my coffee. So I mentioned XAML had been around for a long time. It came out with WPF. It was a new invention when WPF came out in about 2006, depending on when you officially define the release. But think of the world in 2006. If you were in tech at that time, I can't tell if you look young or old, or if you are young or old. But 2006, pre-iPhone. If you were doing web development, that was pre-jQuery. In fact, it was before we knew that JavaScript did just have some good parts, and they were much smaller than the whole of JavaScript. If you were in the .NET world, you probably never heard of MVC, although now that was kind of a standard thing in the web world. And when WPF came out, in comparison to what was there before it, which was web forms, it was a really good thing. It was built on XML, which at the time was kind of the darling of the web world. It was going to be the future of all communication formats. It was before Ajax came along, which was kind of a precursor or tied in with the release of jQuery, about that sort of same time frame. And everything was going to be, well, XML, it's the wave of the future. It had only been around a few years. XML was only officially around since '98, which surprised me when I found that out. And it was expected to be the way of the future. We're going to put all the data over the internet in XML. It was brilliant because it was machine readable and it was human readable. We looked like we were onto a winner. When WPF came out, there was loads of other tooling. We had Visual Studio was new. We had Visual Studio Blend. We had great tooling. We had this exciting new thing, and everything was going to be great. But that's not how things are now, obviously. So the big difference is that when WPF was created, it was intended that we would use lots of tooling, some of which existed at the time, some of which was hoping would come later, to create our XAML files. It was never intended that we would write all our XAML files by hand. However, now the way most XAML files are written is by hand. And most of those XAML files are written in the same way they were written, structured and laid out 15 years ago. If you've been using C# for that long, think for a minute what it would be like if you were having to write C# today like you were 15 years ago. So thinking about sort of C# 2, maybe C# 3, if we want to say that XAML has the equivalent, has had the equivalent of maybe 3 versions, C# 2, C# 3. So you don't have things like link, async, lambdas, extension methods, no dynamics, no auto properties, no named arguments, and no other newer things like even like string interpolation or pattern matching. No source generators, which like everyone's styling at the moment. Imagine going back to writing like C# 2, C# 3. You wouldn't willingly do it. You wouldn't voluntarily do it, would you? Now think if we'd had all the equivalent innovations in XAML, our XAML could have changed and evolved massively and been much more nice to work with, much more pleasurable to work with, just like C# has become over the years. So let's think about doing things differently. I'm going to propose 5 different things we can do, or things we can think about in terms of our XAML files and working with XAML. I'm going to show you a C# equivalent and then see how that applies to XAML. And I want to start by thinking about formatting. If you're sensitive to badly formatted code, brace yourselves. Here is some C# code. I know some of you are in an auditorium, but hopefully you can read that. And you see Lots of things you wouldn't see in a C# code today. You wouldn't write a C# code like that today. You wouldn't work with a C# file like that today. There are tabs all over, mixture of tabs and spaces. There's weird tabbing, there's weird spaces, there's blank lines all over the place, there's weird line wrapping. It just basically looks inconsistent and a mess. And of course, if you came across code like that, you would instantly just say, hey, editor, hey, Visual Studio, fix that for me. Oh, and Visual Studio would turn it into something like this. Nicely, consistently formatted, easier to visually look at and gain some understanding. You're not distracted by inconsistencies. With that in mind, here is a XAML file, and it looks like pretty much every XAML file in the world. A high 90% of them anyway, enough that I will use hyperbole and say all XAML files look like this. They're just messy and inconsistent. We've got like weird indentations, mixes of tabs and spaces, blank lines for no good reason, inconsistent orders, inconsistent tabbing. It's just not great. Now we could ask Visual Studio to fix this, tidy it up and make it more consistent, and it would do a bit of a job, but it wouldn't do a very good job. It's almost like XAML isn't a priority. However, there is a tool called XAML Styler. I think it's got a bad name because it doesn't do anything to styles in XAML are something completely different. This is a XAML formatter, and what this is a really powerful XAML formatter, which gives you lots of control, lots of options. You plug it into Visual Studio and say, hey, format my XAML, or you plug in the command line version into your build pipeline and say, format the XAML, and you get something lovely like this. You see all that white space and tabs and spacing issues are all made consistent. The order of attributes, the layout of attributes is made consistent. What this gives you is a bunch of benefits. A bunch of benefits you get from any well-formatted code. You know, it makes things easier to find. It makes inconsistencies easier to spot. It makes it easy, and by removing those problems and removing those inconsistencies, it makes it easier to understand, and it makes it easier to spot changes when you make it and when you're doing a review. If someone's made a change and you need to do a code review, that's easier at least. You can see what's different. You're not distracted by weird formatting things. Weird formatting things, the bane of code reviews everywhere. Let's stop for a minute and mention Blend. So Blend was a tool created in the past. It's still around. It doesn't get much love, but it still exists. And it was intended for people working on UIs to be able to design the UI and build the UI, and developers writing the logic and the business functionality would use Visual Studio, both work on the same project. The things would go together lovely. And because these were designers who were trying to be lured away from tools like Photoshop and whatever other Adobe products were the flavor of the month at the time, this was rich designers where the underlying XAML didn't matter. And formatting wasn't made a priority. And I think that early lack of consideration for formatting has kind of just stuck around forever. And it's the result of the fact that we were not meant to be writing XAML by hand. We were meant to be, it was hoped we would be using tooling. The ability to do things by hand was kind of a bonus and a fallback. It was never the intention for the way to work. So formatting, don't rely on Visual Studio tooling. Go out to third-party extensions available in the Visual Studio Marketplace. There are some other ones as well, but XAML Styler is generally recognized as the most popular and the most powerful. But let's think about responsibility. Particularly, I want to think about the idea of single responsibility as part of the solid principles. Solid principles have been taking a bit of a knock recently. The core developer people think they're a bit passé, but I think at least the single responsibility principle is still really important, still really useful. So let's again think about, or let's look at some C# code. Here is some C# code. It is a classic example of code that does not follow the single responsibility principle. If we take a look, we can see it's doing a bunch of things. It's some kind of related to some kind of ordering system. We have a method place order that takes a basket and a user, is doing some validation, is linking out to some other thing to create an invoice, is taking responsibility with a database to save the invoice or save the order, and then it's doing something with an SMTP client, sending a message. All things you would hopefully all look at and go, that's not good. That's trying to do too much. It's trying to do it in a bad way. There's all sorts of potential issues here. And you're right, there are all sorts of potential issues there. There are lots of ways this could be made much, much better. There are ways this could be made worse. So I created this shocking example. I made it up entirely. I was originally going to put more bad things in it, show more bad practices, but it became too big and couldn't really read it on the screen. And everyone likes it when you can fit everything on the screen, don't they? Yes, it makes things much easier. At which point it made me think about this XAML file. This is a small XAML file. It has like 20 things on it, but it's huge and unreadable, and you definitely can't fit it on one screen. But anyway, we'll come back to that. So we've got our badly badly structured C# code, breaking the single responsibility principle, doing lots of things. So let's think about UI. I want to think about making some UI that looks a bit like this. So on our screen, in the bottom right-hand corner of our window, we want to have 3 buttons, A, C, and D, in a row. And if you know XAML, you might expect that the way to create something like that would be something like this. So within our grid, at the very bottom, we have our buttons. We have a lot of our definitions and other content and stuff, but we've just got our buttons. In fact, we've just got our buttons. And if we look at them, we can see we've got button A, button C, button D. But I think they're doing multiple things. They're doing the representing a button, so defining the content and what should happen when you click on them. But we've also got these rows and columns and margins and grid properties that we're setting. And those are all about layout and positioning. So we've got at least 2 responsibilities here. We've got the what should the button look like and do when you click on it, and also where should it be, how should it be laid out, how should it be positioned. That's definitely at least 2 things. And that is a way to highlight the potential issue there. Imagine I wanted to add a button B between button A and C. Now, if I did that, I would also, at the very minimum, have to also change some of the definitions and the properties of button C and of button D. If I wanted to add a additional button at the end after button D, a button E, I'd have to change some of the margin properties on button D, just to get that padding slightly, or the padding on the margin slightly differently. These are doing 2 things. It's doing the content and the layout and the presentation. What instead if it looks something like this? I've now got a row of buttons, and we'll come back to that in more detail, but that's taking care of the layout and the positioning. And then I've got my actual buttons, my 3 buttons. All they care about is the things related to being a button. What now if I wanted to add a button B between button A and C? I could add that in easily, couldn't I? I wouldn't need to change anything else, touch any other lines. I could add a button E at the end. Again, I wouldn't need to change anything else. So why don't we write code like this more often? Separate those responsibilities, move the content away from the things that do the layout and the positioning. Now introduce this control, this element, this row of buttons. And it's just a really simple custom class that extends a stack panel and applies some properties to it. It's just a simple, lightweight class that makes my code easier to manage. If we were doing all this in C#, you wouldn't think twice about creating a lightweight custom helper class to make your code easier to understand, easier to read. Ah, you may say, but what about grids? I'm always told use grids for everything. Grids are the greatest. Now, grids are useful, grids are great. Always using grids for everything is kind of the absolute that leads to problems, leads to potential issues. Grids are useful, but understandable code I find is even better. You might say, but what about performance? I use grids because I'm told, and I've heard Microsoft people say this recently, always use grids, they're much more performant. Okay, they might be more performant, but is performance the overriding priority for your code? Now, if the performance of your code is the most important thing over readability, over maintainability, over anything else, and you can say that yes, and I've measured it, that I'm using this grid here and it does make my UI more performant, then absolutely do that. If you can measure it and it doesn't really make a difference, and having code that's easier to read and understand and maintain is more important, then do that. If performance is the most important thing in your application, are you really writing all the other code in the most performant way? Is your C# always the most performant? I'm not going to look at your C# and go, well, you've got for each loop there, that's not fast. You've got link there, that's not fast. There are faster ways, more performant ways of doing things, but we don't always use the most performant one. And we shouldn't default to a default argument of this is fastest, therefore you should always use it. I'm also not saying you should never use attached properties. So attached properties, which are how we set the row and the column for the grid, and attached properties are really useful. It doesn't mean we should use them for everything. I think of attached properties as being equivalent to extension methods in C#. Don't use extension methods for everything, do you? Use them in places where they're appropriate. I think the same applies here. And we've got this, so I've got this custom class, this row of buttons. How does it make it more, make the code easier to work with? Well, I think some of the clues are in the name. How would you expect to lay things out? As a column, just looking at the name row of buttons, is it going to lay things out vertically or horizontally? What should you put in it? Buttons, obviously. What happens if you put something else in it? Well, maybe nothing. It might work fine, but wouldn't it be obvious you're using it in a way that's beyond the original intention? Would that raise questions? Would that make you think twice about how you're doing it? If you're reviewing some code which had a thing called a row of buttons and in it there were all sorts of other controls, would you not stop and ask questions? Would you not think maybe this is going to help me, maybe using a different name or a different class is going to help me create code that's easier for other people to understand? I think that's the case. So let's think about naming. Again, here's some C# code. So let's start at the top. And outside of a demo or some code you're going to throw away, would you ever create a method called do stuff? And I can't see you, but hopefully you're shaking your head, because of course you wouldn't, because it's not at all helpful name. It's not descriptive of anything. It doesn't help anyone reading that in the future. Now stop for a minute, and I want to take you to an imaginary world where the tax system is simple, and the way we calculate taxes is always 20%. Whatever the tax is, just add on 20%. Whatever the price is, you add on 20%, and that's the taxable amount. Oh, that would be lovely and simple. And in this world, we need to write. So we're writing some code which deals with prices and tax. So would we create a method called add 20%? Well, we know that tax is 20%, so we'll just call it add 20%. And in all the different places in our code where we need to do this, we'll just call the add 20% method. And I hope you can see where I'm going with this, but I'm sure at some point in the future, you might notice there's another reason to add 20% for something. And you might spot this nice little helper method which says add 20% and go, well, I'll just call that. I need to add 20%, I'll call the add 20% method. That'll be fine. And now we've got lots of different places in our code calling this add 20% method for different reasons. Then what happens? The government realised that a single flat rate tax of 20% on everything is far too simple and we need to make it much more complicated. And so they changed the rules about adding how you calculate tax or how you add tax to a price. Now, we've got this code base which is calling this add 20% method all over the place to calculate tax. Do we change the name of the method in that now tax might be more calculated in a more complicated way? Do we keep it being called add 20% but change the logic internally so it might not be adding 20%? Do we create a new method, which we call for when we calculate tax? But now we've got to identify all the places in our code where we were calling this add 20% method for something other than tax related calculations. None of those scenarios make it easy to support and maintain. However, if when we were calculating tax, we called our method add tax and the rules around tax calculations change, we don't need to change our method. And if someone had been calling it for reasons other than calculating tax, that's on them. But at least we've done our best with the way we've named our method. Okay, let's think about the UI. Here we have some UI related code. And at the top we have static resource applied to a margin. Now this is from some code which Microsoft will tell you is best practice. And I am going to try and argue that it's not. So we've got our static resource, okay? And it's called medium left right margin. What does that mean? Well, it's got a margin suffix, so it's probably to be used as some kind of margin. Okay, what does medium mean? In the context of the application, you know, a smallish amount? How big? What does the left right bit mean of this name? Does it mean it's a margin that's applied to the sides? Okay, so it's just a margin of a small amount put on each side. Can I use this everywhere? Does it matter if I use this everywhere? Well, let's say I go and use this in all sorts of different places throughout my application. After all, various places in my UI need a medium left-right margin, or need values that are represented by this medium left-right margin. Now, the way this is intended to be used is that the medium left-right margin is applied to a page. It is actually the medium amount should be put on each side of the content within a page. That's brilliant, okay. So why not call it something like default page margin or standard page margin? That way I'm not going to start applying it in different places. Someone looking at the code will go, oh, that's the page and I put the standard page margin. Brilliant. If someone goes, here's an image in the middle of some other stuff and they put a standard page margin on it, well, that might raise question marks or questions. What if we update our UI design and we want to increase the margin we apply to a standard page, or we want to increase the margin on one side of a standard page so that there's slightly more space on the right than there is on the left now? If we've been using this medium left-right margin in places other than for a standard page margin, then that's going to have all sorts of unintended consequences when we make a change, because the purpose of our margin or purpose of our resource wasn't clearly defined. We want a name that implies where and how it should be used, not what its internals do. Let's look at this action red button. C#, that's fine. It's a custom class, but could be okay. And it's an action red button. Okay, what's an action red button mean? It's probably got some meaning tied up within the application. It probably means something to the person who authored it. but there's all sorts of potential issues here. What happens if we redesign the application in the future and we restyle it, and everything that was red now needs to be green? Do we have a thing called action red button that's actually green? Well, that could be confusing. Do we have to go and rename everything? Do we have to go and create an additional class and apply that everywhere? And what is this action red button? Now, in the context of the application this came from, which wasn't a recommended best practice, I just stole this from a random application. In that application, this was the default button. So why not just call the class default button? Then if the styling ever changes, if the color ever changes, we don't need to change the name of the control and when we use it. And if it's a default button, that gives us some other information as well. If I put 2 default buttons on a page, wouldn't that raise questions when you're looking at the code? Wouldn't that suggest that maybe something's wrong? At the very least, we need to ask some questions. So default button. Yeah, you know, if we call it default button, that would give us writing the code and anyone looking at the code in the future a better idea of what it's supposed to do and give us other clues as well. Related to this, let's think about magic values. So magic values in terms of magic numbers or magic strings, you know, constant values which are just reapplied all over the place. So in C#, going back to our tax example, and it might be this 1.2 value. Look at the top, we could calculate our tax. We just need to add 20%. So we just multiply it by 1.2. And if all someone saw was that top line, they'd go, or reasonably, they might go, why is this multiplied by 1.2? But if we defined a named constant for that, called it tax multiplier, then we could easily look at the code and we could understand that it was why it was being used and what it was being used for. If the tax multiplier ever changed, so rather than making the tax more complicated, it was just reduced to 10% everywhere, we could come in one place, make one change, and that would be applied throughout the whole code base. I wouldn't need to go and look for all the 1.2s, work out if they were related to tax, and then change the individual values. Simple stuff. You hopefully learned about that a long time ago in your C# code. Now let's think again about the some UI. So here's some UI. So it's a pretty kitten, obviously, but imagine this is part of the UI we want to create. We want to create a list of items, and for each item we're going to have an image and some text, and we're going to put a board around it. We are going to style that text a bit differently, but you know, it's something you've seen in many applications. Most applications, pretty much every mobile app in the world has a list and it's got an image with some text next to it. I'm sure you've seen it all the time. And if we think about what that UI might look like, it's not unreasonable that you might have assumed it would be something like this, or someone might write something like this. Here's our data template for each of the items in the list, and we've got a border for our green border, and then we've got a grid for the layout stuff, which has got an image and some labels. So I think this was from some Maui code, but that doesn't matter. The same rules apply everywhere. So let's look at a few things. Let's start by looking at the magic value of sea green. What does sea green mean? Is it reasonable to expect that there's probably lots of places in our code base where sea green is specified? If we specified it here, then probably. And this spacing in this margin I've highlighted. If you've looked at lots of XAML code, you've invariably seen margins and spacings repeatedly defined all over the place throughout the code. Now what we could do, and what we should do, obviously, is create resources for those things. But we'll name them well. Rather than we'll call our sea green just like our green color, well, let's call it the highlight color, because this is the color we use to highlight things within the application. This margin, this is the same margin we apply to everything we call an item within the concept of our application. And where the spacing between elements of an item, they're always spaced the same. So we call that our intra-item spacing. And we apply that throughout the application in all our pages. And we get consistent formatting across all our pages. We get consistent styling. If we need to change something, I can change it in one place and have it apply throughout the whole application. Brilliant, but it brings other benefits as well. Imagine for accessibility reasons, you needed to give people the option to increase the spacing between text in the application to make it easier to read. Well, if we've got a resource, we need to be a dynamic resource, not a static resource, but we could change that spacing if we go into our increased readability mode and have that change applied automatically throughout the code. What we don't want to be doing is trying to write C# code that dynamically modifies the contents of the UI based on a setting. We want just that setting to be applied automatically. What about all those different resources we might create? So here again, from that horrible example of what apparently you should do, but I think you really shouldn't, because once you start having small left, small top, small right, small left, right, small top, small right, small top, bottom, small left, top, right, bottom margin, that's just not just silly, that's ridiculous. So now we know that medium is 24. Medium is 24, did you know? I don't think medium should be 24, that seems like large to me, but I guess not. But here we've got these magic numbers repeated all over the place. Loads of 12s in there, loads of 24s and 8s and more, and where this came from. Instead, what if we could just define those numbers once? So here we know medium is 24, small is 12, extra small is 8. Well, here I've got a thing called standard, which can be small or extra small. And then I just apply that to all my thicknesses where I need them. Aha. Now the knowledgeable or the eagle-eyed among you might have spotted that little green squiggle and say, but you can't do that. And you're right, you can't do that, which is annoying. But I saw that as a challenge rather than a limiting problem. So I said, well, if a thickness can't do that, I'll just create my own version. I've now got an item margin where I can bind my standard item spacings to it, so rather than specify 8 repeatedly. And that's my XAML thickness. XAML thickness, obviously, this is a thing I created. It's just a really simple object with 4 properties. But the important thing is this thing down the bottom. I've just created an implicit conversion to a thickness. I can use this like a thickness anywhere I would use an actual thickness. So I can use a XAML thickness like a thickness. You don't get some of the propagation of dynamic properties, which is not brilliant, but that's just a limitation of the way thicknesses were designed. But I've just created a simple little helper class, 4 properties. If it was all C#, we wouldn't think twice about that. Why is no one doing this for XAML files? So our code starts to get simpler. Let's now look at this text. Again, we're specifying specific properties for the way we want to style our text. So in an ideal world, our designers would have come along and said, this is how we want the designs to be. This is, these are the colors it's used. This is the way to define the typography. We see in the bottom left where we've got some categories of text. So there's a display, a headlines, a titles, a label, a body, and a caption. And we could create equivalent styles, which we apply to our UI. So we might get something like this. We might get a style for title text and subtitle text and one for default text. The names don't really matter. They're not brilliant, but they will do. And I look at that and I go, well, that's great, but this makes me feel like I'm saying, give me a label and turn it into the type of label which is a title text, which feels like I'm casting or converting the label into something else. I'm not a big fan of unnecessary casting. I'd rather make custom types and use custom types instead. So let's think about custom types. Imagine in our C# world, we have some of you are in a university, aren't you? Of course you understand this. You just done this from like every other demo ever. You have a person and you have a student, which derives from person. Now, imagine I needed to write a method which was going to do something with a student. I could pass in a person, cast it into a student, and then do the work. And there might be cases where you have to do that. Hopefully not. It'd be much more preferable that if you're going to do something with a student, you just give it a student. So if I know I need some title text, why am I getting a label and then turning it into the title text? What if I did this? Just give me the title, or just use the title, just use the subtitle, just use the default text. And the names don't particularly matter. Use names which are meaningful to you and the application. But is that, I know it looks different to what you're used to, but is that easier to read? Is it more meaningful? Has it got semantics? Would it make it easier to spot if that was used for something inappropriate? I think it would. Oh, I did it to the border as well. You missed that. A standard border. I'll probably use that in a bunch of places in my application. And as such, I don't want to be specifying a bunch of properties each time. So what is my standard item border? It's just a regular border, and I just automatically apply the resource, the style to it. My title is just a regular label. I just automatically apply the title text to it. I did this in an application. It made the code so much easier to write, to read, and to write, and to understand and maintain. It looks a bit weird when you first start seeing it, but it quickly becomes much easier to work with. The problem is you got to create all these little types, and depending on how you count it, it's 3 or 7 lines of code, and it's a little cut and paste. It's easy to do. I did it over 100 times in the first app I did this with, but yeah, you don't want to be doing that 100 times. You don't want to have to create all those types yourself, do you? No, of course you don't. So let's look at something else. I appreciate this text is a bit small. There's a bigger version, which I'll show you in a minute. But if we look on the left, we've got our resource dictionary with some colors and a brush and some styles defined in it. And on the right-hand side, we have some C# code, which is the equivalent for all those types. So if we start at the bottom on the right-hand side, if we work our way up, we've got an error button. Derives from button just applies the error button style. We've got a super button. Derives from button just applies the super button style. And a standard button as well. And then I've got some collections of app brushes, whereas there's just one in this example, just to keep, or to try and keep it sort of small. But it's the name of the resource, it's the name of the class. I might need to refer to this in multiple places in my application. And if I do, I don't want to be having to write that magic string of app center brush every time. Or if I need to refer to a color directly in code behind. And having these constants defined makes it easier to avoid mistakes. Because if you're really, really eagle-eyed, you'll notice there's a random capital O in my secondary color. Now, if I needed to write the string within quotation marks secondary color in various places in my application, it would be easy for someone not to see that there was a random capital O, or to come along and correct that or change it in one place, and then things break because we've got strings which are subtly different. But if I've got defined constant, I can refer to the defined constant. And the key bit here, collapse the very top in grey, just to be awkward, is an auto-generated tag, because all these styles were automatically generated. Here's the bigger version, just so you can see. So at the top, we've got the original style, and at the bottom, we've got a generated class, which makes it easy to work with that arrow button style. And the way I did that was I just built a custom tool. Visual Studio has the ability to apply custom tools that like any file. And if you look at a regular XAML with code behind, there is already something doing that. But if you've got a resource dictionary which hasn't got code behind, you can write your own custom tools. And there are people who write custom tools to help with their development all the time. I have yet to meet someone else who has written any kind of custom tooling, whether it plugs in like this or in other ways, to help create their XAML files. Actually, I know one person. It's a tool called XAML Studio, which is like a whole massive tooling application which helps you work with XAML and create XAML. But nothing to build and add into your own build pipelines. But this is really easy to do, and I will share the tools I've built to do this. This was a WinUI version, but I have MAUI and WPF versions as well. This was really relatively easy to do, but really powerful. Now, if you're feeling very smart and clever, you might go, but what about all those sealed types in WinUI 3? And I go, yeah, they're annoying, aren't they? But that's not going to stop me. So what I do is I'll just create a facade type around those sealed types. So if you say you want to build a style over a text block, I'll generate a class over an RX text block, which internally has all the same properties and methods and events. So you can use it just like a regular text block, and it has that implicit conversion to a text block. So if it needs to be a text block, it can be. Makes it really easy to work with. You set the style slightly differently, but that's not a problem. Yeah, I can deal with that. You might think, but I happen to know that there is an issue with using merged dictionaries in MAUI apps, such that you can't reference the types in code behind it. And I go, yeah, that's annoying as well, and I don't agree with the reasons why it exists, but it exists. But we could get around that as well. We just need to do a bit more work, a few more lines of code. And of course, we don't write those lines of code over and over again. I just built a little helper for that. So my generated type for a MAUI looks really simple. Someone asked me the other week, does this work with a designer? And my first question was, what designer? But they were using WPF, and WPF does still have a designer. And yes, it works with a designer. You have to build the code first, but it works. So the default at the top is the regular text block. The default in big and red is my text block, which is just applying that my text block style. So yeah, it works with a designer if you have one. And this principle can be carried out into more complex scenarios and more complex applications. Here's a big application. Well, it's a reasonably sized application, mobile application, as you probably guessed by all the portrait format screens. And you can't see all the details, but you can see there are a lot of different screens designed there. If you could see the details, you might notice that there's a similarity in a lot of these pages, that probably just over half of them, they have this custom toolbar at the top, which has text and back buttons and maybe different icons and things in it. And so if we've got these pages with these standard toolbars at the top, we might put the toolbars in a grid, because we use grids for everything. And we'd have a standard definition. So our code might look like this. And then you look at that and go, okay, grid, row definitions, all magic values. Let's get rid of the magic values. So yeah, we can do that. So we can improve the code slightly by defining resources for our row definitions. And we've added a custom type for our navbar. That's progress. So we've got content page, grid, row definitions. Now, if the designer comes along and says, actually, I want to make that top nav a bit bigger or a bit smaller, we can just change it in one place, have the change applied everywhere. Brilliant. but we can go further. This is what we did in this instance. I would do things differently now or in the future, but hopefully this gives you an idea of what was going on. So we just created a custom type for our grid with a bit of logic about how the rows are defined. And now instead of having a grid with definitions that are repeated, I just have grid for page with navbar. Guess where that should be used? And then we've got our top navbar with its containers and its custom controls and things in it, and then the other content just in a scroll view at the bottom. Could go further with this. We could add the top navbar as a property of the grid. We could add the content, let's put the scroll in a content, automatic power scroll. There's lots of ways that could be improved, but even just in terms of defining that grid, we greatly simplified loads and loads and loads of pages, loads of files by defining a simple custom type. And what about managing all those types? Well, all these extra types are C# classes. Do you have problems managing lots of C# classes? I hope not. And if you did, there are standard approaches to managing these. Well, first off, all the ones that are auto-generated, you don't need to think about. They just get taken care of for you. But if you're creating these types yourself, well, we use folders and we can use namespaces to take care of managing types. Not a problem. So let's put all this together into one big example, show all the different things we've seen. So remember this massive file I briefly flashed up earlier. Let's think about that again. And let me ask you the question, would you rather fight 1 horse-sized duck or 100 duck-sized horses? Or would you rather work with one massive file or lots of little files? Would you rather work with one massive class or lots of little classes? I'm going to assume you'd all go for the lots of small files, lots of small classes. So here's an app. It's a simple 2-page app. It is the one that is created as part of the .NET MAUI workshops, which are a self-guided workshop where you can learn to build a .NET MAUI application. On the left, we see the list page. You know, it's a list. It's got an image on the left and text on next to it. Obviously, we see that everywhere. You can click on one of those items. It takes you to the detail page. It's just what you see on the right, which is our little Capuchin monkey and some information. And there's a back button. You can navigate between it. Simple. Okay, so let's look at the XAML. Well, the first thing we notice, of course, is that the XAML is horribly formatted. We can't even see it. It's really small. So let me help you out a little bit. Wave my magic code wand, and this is the whole detail page on one screen. And you'll notice that there's quite a lot of text there. You might spot there's some comments to try and make it easier to work with. It's a relatively small, relatively simple page, and yet it needs comments to explain it. That's not a good sign, is it? Let me wave my magic wand again, and let's apply all the things I've shown you to this code base. Look at it. This is before and after. I've got loads of space now. I've got so much space I could even put the image of the screen in so you can see it for reference. Now you will notice that there are an awful lot of, about like the top third of the screen is just boilerplate stuff we have to have in for our page. Can't get rid of that yet. I have ideas for the future. But you might also notice I've gone from having a page with a grid with a scroll viewer in it. So now I have a vertically scrolling page. I've replaced 3 controls with 1. I have named it vertically scrolling page. What do you think it does? Yes, it scrolls things vertically. Simple, you know, got rid of a bunch of stuff. That has a property for the title, and that's the Capuchin monkey that appears at the top of the screen. Under that, I have my header image. So on the previous page, about half of the page was taken up with that color block, that big block of yellowy orange, and the circular image. It's a lot of logic. So what I've done is extracted that into a separate control, separate class. I could reuse if I needed to, but actually it just makes this code simpler because I've extracted some of the complexity and isolated it. I've got my header image, I just specify the color and the image, and it takes care of drawing the circle in the appropriate place on the color block. Then I have my page details. What goes in my page details? Well, unsurprisingly, the details for the page. What this is doing, this is my layout positioning. This is my, not actually the content, this is the layout stuff. What this is doing is just putting everything in a vertical stack, and it's setting a standard margin on each side of the page, so my text doesn't run up to the very edge of the screen. And then I have my text button, custom type. What do you think it does? Yes, it's a button that just contains text. Then I've got default text and small text, which show my details, my location, and my population. Simple. If you look at the image on the right, you will see there are 7 things on that page. I have 7 elements in my file. Would you rather work with this code or the previous code? Yes, this looks different to what you've seen because it's simpler and easier to work with. It's easier to change. If you were completely new to this code base and I told you that I need you to make a change, what we want to do is we want to also include the life expectancy between the location and the population. It's already in the data model. Could you just put that in? Where would you put that? Well, it would be, well, you'd say, well, how do you want it formatted? And I say, just the same as the location and the population. Brilliant. You would know to go in and add a new small text element between the other 2. What if I wanted to move my location above the details? Well, I could easily just move that one line of code, swap those 2 lines around, and it wouldn't have any unintended consequences. I kind of pause a lot because this is a lot to take in for a lot of people. I am not saying you have to rewrite all your code. I'm not saying you have to use these names. I'm not saying you have to do everything I've said. What I've done is I've identified some really basic, really obvious, I think, patterns which apply to all other programming languages and applied them to XAML. Is it not worth considering doing that yourself? In part, maybe as you go in and changing other things, don't just go and change everything automatically. If you want to, that'd be great, and tell me how you get on. But you don't need to do everything all at once. Talked about formatting consistently. Having standards, using them consistently, it just makes everything easier to work with. Don't mix the content and its layout and positioning. Think about names and magic numbers. Don't duplicate things. Don't worry about creating custom types. You do it in C# all the time. It doesn't need to be a problem here. You don't have to create user controls and content controls and custom controls. They can be just really simple, lightweight types. Extend the basic stuff that's already there. Yes, there's like more you can do in the future. You can build your own complex custom types if you want to. But just start with the basic ones. That even just doing that makes a big difference. And if you're interested in building Maui apps, I have a tool in the Visual Studio Marketplace called Maui App Accelerator, which will just help you get started building apps much quicker, hopefully. So you can check that out or look on my Twitter, and it's kind of something I tweet about quite a lot. But that was what I wanted to say about XAML. I can't see you, so I'm going to hope you're still there.
Yes, we are still here.
Oh, good.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Is there any questions for Matt on that? Yeah, up the back. I'll come up the back, and then Matt, you tell me if you can hear the question.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It's about can I use Bootstrap or some other designer to put, use this framework when you create your XAML files? Do you understand, Marie?
Did you get that, Matt?
It's about.
Can you repeat or paraphrase?
You have the microphone.
Yeah.
I understood.
Yeah. So what what were you wanting to use? The
This, for example, when you create a web page, commonly you use Bootstrap or another framework to,
Oh, Bootstrap.
don't be,
Yep.
spend more time styling or this kind of thing.
Yep.
You can use similar libraries or third libraries.
Yeah. So are there similar libraries for XAML like you would use Bootstrap for HTML?
Not
think
that
this is-
I'm aware of. So there are a few libraries which create a bunch of custom controls. So and they tend to be different for different platforms, and they might all be styled the same. So in the Xamarin and Mario World, there's a collection called Sharknado, and they have a bunch of extra controls which all work together and all look lovely. And there are other ones, and there are different ones for WPF and other things as well. But there's nothing sort of general purpose, and there's nothing equivalent to the likes of Bootstrap.
Yeah.
In the world of XAML, unfortunately.
Sharknado. That's a great name. Any other questions in the room? I'll just check if there's any questions. If there's anyone online had any questions, feel free to either post to the chat or unmute if you want to ask anything. I'm not seeing anything, so
in that case, let me ask: did that make sense? Was it? Have I said something shocking? Have I said something wrong? Or does this feel like it makes sense and you can see that there's some sort of logic there?
I'm seeing nodding heads and thinking minds, I think, if I could summarize like that. Yeah, and I think people are taking it in. To me, it kind of feels like it's sort of like common sense, but you never really, because it was XAML, it always felt like it wasn't C#, but it's almost like you're just reminding us that there is C# under the hood there, and we can take advantage of that. Yeah,
that it's just XAML approach or mindset. It seems to have sort of permeated the world, and it's unfortunate because XAML is the best solution in a lot of scenarios, and yet people don't want to have to think about it because it's not great. But if we take a bit of time to think about it and just apply some what might seem like common sense when we actually do think about it, it does make a difference.
Yeah. And some comments in the chat from Tim and from Jody as well. So, again, seem to think it's good. A question from Simon: do you define custom controls in XAML itself or in C#?
So you can do both. So you can create what are called user controls, which have that combination of XAML and C#, which work together. But they're just a bit too complicated. You can make, they're more complicated than it works for a lot of people. And so I like to show this just as even without the complicated, you might have been put off by having to do user controls in the past side of things. You can make a quick, easy benefit just by doing some C# stuff.
We'll have to do the clap again.
That's all right. I saw the virtual clap, wavy clap.
Clap again. So you got 2 applauses, so that's good. Now, thanks very much, Matt, and hope the rest of your day goes smoothly. And thanks for joining us again. And thanks very much. Catch everyone else later on, and for those in the room, we'll enjoy the pizza and catch you all again next month.